First, sorry for the delay in videos, I was real sick for a while, but Russia's poor performance in the war in Ukraine has surprised a lot of people. Now, there's a lot of factors that can help explain why, such as the massive number of weapons and support coming from the West, but also the US has struggled and could be considered having lost against, on paper, much weaker enemies. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq for example. So it's interesting to think just how the US might perform if it was in Russia's place. How might the different US military tactics stand up in a similar situation? Could they have won in 3 days? Or would they struggle like Russia is now? But first, an interesting sponsor this week. Wondrium is an educational and entertaining video service providing highly illuminating, but also easily approachable and comprehensive content. And since you're watching my videos, you are certain to love Wondrium. They have a massive amount of premium content produced by trusted, respected, and inspiring experts. Everything from fiction to even non-fiction content. One cool one I found here is titled Assessing America's National Security Threats by H.R. McMaster. It's a full 12-part series on interesting things that even I learned from, such as the interesting transition from the Cold War to fighting in near peer, to the 21st century of fighting non-state actors, and now trying to jump back to near peer with China. And again, it's not just educational. It's everything from history to tutorials on playing things like guitar, science, health, food, travel, philosophy, math, literature, personal growth, culture, and more. So really make sure you go over and check them out. Right now, Wondrium is giving away a free trial that you can access at wondrium.com/coverkabal. Or you can just go click the link down in the description below. So make sure to give that free trial a try. Again, Wondrium. Any scenario directly comparing how the US would do fighting Ukraine would require an infinite number of conditions and rules, like geography for example. Would the US be where it is now, or would they be where Russia is bordering Ukraine? Also, is Ukraine then receiving weapons from Russia to fight, and so on. So instead, let's look at how each nation's doctrines and tactics would perform against an enemy like Ukraine today. When it comes to Russia, there is a misconception that I see a lot. Several people talk about how Russia actually never planned to take Kyiv early on in the war, as they didn't have 3 times the number of troops attacking as Ukraine had defending. I even saw that in a Wall Street Journal article here. Well, first, the general rule of thumb is 3 times the combat force or capability, not simply manpower. 3 men in a modern tank, for example, could easily defeat dozens or even hundreds of ancient Roman soldiers. Despite the fact that they're way outnumbered, their combat force is much higher. But it's also a lot more complicated. Other things need to be factored in too that would adjust the overall combat capability, such as weather, the terrain they're fighting in, the troops' training and morale, and more. So that 3-to-1 ratio that you might hear often is misleading. There's a lot of factors that could potentially give a way outnumbered and even outgunned force a 3-to-1 superiority over an enemy. Now, the Soviet Union was a little bit late to adopt these ideas. Their massive, superior numbers of forces in Europe meant that it could rely on their sheer numbers. Their offensive doctrine included overwhelming firepower at enemy weak points and defense in depth strategy to slow down and prevent any major breakthroughs by the enemy. But both those required a large quantity advantage over the enemy. It really wasn't until the late Cold War that they started to realize that it wasn't just the sheer number of divisions, or tanks, or aircraft, but what they later called the combat potentials, as well as the factors such as terrain, training, and so on mentioned earlier. Factoring in all these can much better help predict the outcome of a battle, and therefore help you avoid costly losses. However, as we know, not long after the Soviet Union collapsed, and then the main successor, Russia, had their economy and political system in horrible shape. There was no money or system in place to further develop these ideas, let alone implement them. As time went on, things improved, but still today Russia, in ways, resorts to that older idea of quantity and quality as the main factors in determining superiority, which again can get you in trouble and into losing battles that a much more sophisticated approach might help you avoid. So, how does this compare to the US? Well, first, quantity and quality are still important, and obviously the US has a much larger defense budget, and that can, in theory at least, buy more and more capable weaponry. For example, they have nearly 3 times the number of combat aircraft, over 600 of which being 5th generation and stealth aircraft. This all affords the US a much more capable ability to take control of the skies, and therefore make life difficult for any enemy forces on the ground. The major advantage in quantity of dollars also provides the US better ISR capabilities, like spy satellites and manned and unmanned aircraft that can help you find the enemy and help destroy them. But money isn't everything. The Taliban was, in a sense, able to win despite having virtually no budget at all. Now, I know that's not a great example, as the Taliban at the time was more of an insurgent group that would blend into the civilian populations, compared to Ukraine's more professional, organized army, but it does show the lack of quantity can be overcome. And the US has really focused on this for a long time out of necessity. Throughout the Cold War, the US and NATO were significantly outnumbered in Europe. This forced them to try to find other ways to fight and win a war without the quantity advantage. One is to try to think of new ways to view the enemy force. You aren't just fighting their tanks or infantry. These combat forces are part of a larger system which includes those fighting directly, but also all the support forces like artillery, air defense, and engineers, logistics providing them all fuel, ammo, rations, maintenance, transportation, etc., as well as the command and control, controlling and directing them all to try to accomplish a mission. Each one of those elements are vital and they all interact and they're dependent on each other. Therefore, if you can destroy or even degrade any one of them, you can win even against a more superior enemy. You could, in theory, defeat them without ever destroying a single enemy tank or soldier. If that tank doesn't have ammo, or fuel, or food for its crew, or has no idea where to go or what to do without command, then it's pretty much useless. Also, just destroying or degrading any one of these elements of the system could have a huge psychological effect as well. If those troops are worried that they'll be left alone without any support, or without food, those forces almost certainly won't be fighting very effectively. And this idea that you're not just fighting your enemy's combat forces, but a whole system, is something that Ukraine seems to understand much better than Russia. There's been several times where Ukraine has been able to identify vital weak points in Russia's system, almost certainly with the help of US intelligence, struck them, and then very quickly collapsed Russia's defenses and made massive gains, like in Kherson and Kharkiv. Now, this concept in general seems pretty straightforward, but it's one thing to understand it, and a whole nother thing to actually successfully use it and exploit it. Another thing the US did is really maximize joint operations. That's using your Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. all together as one. It's really a force multiplier. You may be outnumbered in tanks, for example, but if you have the advantage of receiving real-time intelligence and support from any number of assets, whether aircraft, satellites, or other units nearby, it enables you to find and strike enemy weak points and greatly multiply the effectiveness of those tanks that you do have. So, how would the US do if it were fighting Ukraine? Well, I mean, that's obviously impossible to say with any certainty. The US really hasn't fought any other professional, organized military recently, but it's certainly something that they've studied and studied and studied and studied. But their advantage in quality and quantity over most, if not all nations, along with an extreme focus on fully integrating all its forces in multi-domain operations, really gives it a massive advantage. It really epitomizes the saying that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, on paper, and in theory at least, the US would perform much better than Russia in Ukraine.